Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast, where we interview growers from all over the world, both beginners and experts, seeking to learn more about what they know about gardening and how they do things in their garden. What's up, everybody? For you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 133. In this episode, I interview Corey from Inside Hydro. He is a fellow YouTuber with nearly 40,000 subscribers, and his channel revolves around hydroponics, more specifically RDWC. And that's what we're going to get into in today's episode. He talks about what RDWC is, pros, cons, equipment setup, how he grows plants in his system, and so much more. If you want to see short bite-sized clips of these episodes, search Garden Talk Clips on YouTube. I also have a gardening channel where I show the plants that I've grown. Both of those channels will be linked down in the YouTube description section below. One of my goals for this podcast is to bring free information about gardening to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's episode who helped make that goal possible. Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this episode. Check out their Ion Frame LED grow lights, which have the latest Samsung Evo LEDs. These grow lights include a schedule controller that features 10 brightness levels, dimming, and a sunrise-sunset feature. Click the link in the description section below so you can learn more about their Ion Frame LED grow lights, and the discount code MrGrowIt15 works on both Amazon and their website, acinfinity.com. Stash Blend. Stash Blend consists of several ingredients in one, so you no longer have to buy individual bottles. It includes corn steep liquor, seaweed extract, humic acid, beneficial bacteria, silica, and mycorrhizal fungi. It can be used in addition to your synthetic base nutrients or be used in living soil systems. Simply mix it into water and water your plants with it. You can get it at stashblend.com, link in the description section below, and use the discount code THESTASH. And we're back, and today I'm joined with Corey from Inside Hydro. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, man. Thanks for coming on to the podcast today. I'm familiar with your work, fellow YouTuber, and you got some really good content in regards to hydroponics. Today we're going to talk all about hydroponics, in particular RDWC. And this was actually a request from Cam Z. He's a Patreon supporter of mine. Big shout out to him. I know he's in a DWC system. I'm pretty sure he's recirculating as well. Shout out to all the Patreons, really, everyone that supports. Patreon.com/MrGrowIt. 100% of what is supported on there goes right back towards the podcast. So just want to give a big thank you to all the supporters out there. But before we get too deep into the conversation of hydroponics, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into gardening?
Sure. So my name is Corey. I run the channel Inside Hydro. I've been growing for probably a little bit more than 8 years now, actually. I started when I was 18. So luckily, Massachusetts was one of the first legalized states, and we kind of knew that was coming for a little bit beforehand. So I did get started a little bit early. And when I started, I actually knew nothing. I mean, I had no experience with any kind of plant at all, but I am a pretty fast learner. I think I can pick things up pretty quickly. I like to believe at least. So I just did a lot of research. I actually knew right away that DWC was the way I wanted to go. So that's what I started with, actually. And I just ran a bunch of single buckets for the first couple of years. I built off of that little bit of knowledge or experience that I was gaining every grow. And eventually I understood what I was doing. And since then, I've just made small tweaks that ultimately result in a better run. And I've actually been growing on YouTube for 7 years now across a few different channels. Unfortunately, this is the third one. Hopefully the last one, things are starting to lighten up a little bit, I hope. So I'm just crossing my fingers.
Man, I hate the fact that YouTube does that, man. They take down channels. I had a channel taken down before, as well as 75,000 subscribers wiped out. And that feeling of just knowing that you have to start over completely and everything you've built over those years is gone is just one of the worst feelings, and I don't wish that upon anybody. So sorry to hear that, but I'm glad to see that your new channel here is being built up. You've got coming up on 40,000 subscribers, 37,000 subscribers. That's not easy. So congratulations on your success so far. You have some really, really great videos, and everything revolves around RDWC. Can you tell us, what does RDWC stand for, and can you explain the basic concept behind this hydroponic system?
Sure. So DWC stands for deep water culture, and then RDWC stands for recirculating deep water culture. Really, the only difference between the two is that in RDWC, all of the buckets are connected and using the same nutrient solution, which is recirculating between each pot. So basically, in an RDWC system, if we say it's 6 plants, you'll have 7 buckets, 6 of them being occupied by plants, and then 1 being your control bucket. So all of the buckets are connected with piping and sharing the same nutrients. And not only is the water circulating through all of the buckets, but it's being aerated as well, and each plant has a net pot where the plant sits, and through that pot, the roots grow down and are completely submerged in the solution.
Nice, pretty straightforward description there. So what are some of the pros and cons to growing in an RDWC system?
I would say I might be a little bit biased for this question, but right off the top, the first thing that comes to mind is rate of growth for sure. I mean, these plants grow extremely fast and big in an RDWC system, which can shave off weeks of veg time, which can also save you some money. Also, in RDWC, you're generally going to be using 50% less nutrients throughout the run just because the roots are sitting directly in the solution at all time, making it much easier for them to absorb. That means you can get away with a lot lower ppms. Also, being able to get a 0 ppm flush, I know that's possible in some other systems, but that's really important for me. And then another pro would be maintenance. I mean, once you have the system set up and running, you can just keep reusing it indefinitely. And some cons would be setup costs. If you're not frugal, it can get pretty expensive to buy an RDWC or build an RDWC system. And then, like with any hydroponics, you have moving parts, which also always leaves room for failure. And I actually have my system set up in a way that is kind of fail-proof, I like to believe, at least for the electrical components that are involved.
Okay. And then kind of getting deeper into how the system works. What are the main components of an RDWC system, and how do they work together to grow the plants?
So the main components would be first your circulation pump, and that's what keeps the water circulating throughout each bucket and ensures the solution is always mixed and moving. Stagnant water is never really a good thing. And then also your air pump, which keeps the water oxygenated and makes it livable basically for your roots. Roots need enough oxygen for growth, and that also helps prevent root rot. With those two things, you can pretty much make a system out of anything. Any container pretty much works as long as it's opaque, and all you really need after that is a net pot.
And then you also have a reservoir. Then the tubing connects to a bucket, and typically in RDWC, it's multiple buckets. And then within the buckets, you have what you talked about, the pump, and then the air stones and stuff like that, right?
Yep. Each bucket has its own air stone, and then you'll have one circulation pump that sits inside the control bucket, and you'll have a return line. So the water comes from the control bucket, goes through all of the plant buckets, and then it comes back through the return line back to the control bucket, and that's how it makes its circuit.
Are you running the pump and the air stones 24/7?
Yes, all times, 24/7.
Okay. And then is there any general recommendations for how many air stones to put in each bucket? I know there's some concerns about a lack of aeration, right? And we can get into some of the problems in solutions later on, but one of them is not having enough of that aeration. So how many stones do you typically put in each container?
I'll use one air stone per bucket. I do use the larger ones. They're like a soda can type of shape. But for a general rule of thumb, as long as your entire surface of water is bubbling, then you should be in a pretty good spot.
Good to know. Would you happen to know like wattage that it pulls from the wall, the pump, and the air stones and all that stuff?
I think it's about 1 liter per gallon that you want your pump to put out. So if the system's 50 gallons, it needs to be putting out at least 50 liters per hour. But you can always go higher than that when it comes to the air. You can't really add too much.
Okay. And then as far as power consumption, not really.
Oh,
sure,
power
but
consumption.
yeah,
I'm actually not sure the wattage. I'm not really sure.
okay. I think they're decently low. I want to say around 50 watts, but I could be mistaken there. I know there's different pump sizes. Talking about the pump that's within the main part there, was it in the reservoir is where that main pump is?
I personally put mine in the control reservoir just to prevent any leaks, because if something did go wrong, if you had the pump in the return line, which is somewhere else you can also put it, then there would be a chance of, things leaking onto the ground. I choose to not even have to worry about that, so I do place mine inside the control bucket. So if anything did go wrong, it's just going to leak inside the system. So it's really not going to leak at all.
Got it. That's good to know. And I know you've built your own system there, and it can be a lot cheaper to build your own versus buy one of these pre-made ones, right? So what's the average cost to build your own system versus buying a pre-made one?
So my current system, I've been growing in for about almost 3 years now, and it was $600 to build. The same system from Current Culture will be closer to like $2,000. And granted, they do have a few more features and stuff like that, but it's nothing that you can't live without.
Wow, huge price difference
Yeah.
there. Yeah, I'm looking at the Current Culture ones. I know it's a very popular brand, and man, they've got some big systems there. $1,600 over $2,000. So yeah, it can be very costly there.
Yeah, those are really nice, though. I will give them that.
Let's get a little bit deeper into the system that you've built. Can you break it down for us? Like, what is the bucket size? How big is your reservoir? What size tubing are you using? So on and so forth.
Sure. So my current system, it's built with 8-gallon square buckets. I have 6 plant buckets and then one 8-gallon for the reservoir, and they're all connected with 2-inch PVC piping. So the one thing I will recommend is using the Current Culture bulkheads for your piping and connections from bucket to bucket. They have the best bulkheads I've ever used, and they are pretty expensive. That will probably be the biggest cost of the entire build. Also, if you're going to plan on flowering in the system, I wouldn't go anything less than 2-inch for the piping size to reduce the risks of any clogging or anything like that.
How do you kind of connect everything together? Like there's like a solution that you kind of wipe onto the PVC and then kind of slide it in and it hardens. Is that pretty much?
Yeah, you use PVC cement. It's like a glue for PVC that kind of just bonds the stuff together.
Okay. Any particular brand or anything that you recommend there? Are they all pretty much the same?
It's kind of like what you would use like for house piping. It's the same idea. So I really just get whatever they have at Home Depot. Pretty much anything will work as long as it's made for PVC specifically.
Okay. And then in your 6 buckets that are 8-gallon each, on top, you mentioned net pot. What's the size of the net pot that's on top of the buckets?
I have 6-inch net pots.
6 inch, okay.
Yeah, so it goes 6 inches down into the bucket.
And then what do you put in the net pots?
I use a straight hydroton mix, and then I'll plant my seeds inside rock wool, and then I'll put the rock wool in, and I'll cover that in hydroton clay pebbles.
What else could be used besides the clay pebbles?
Some people choose to use like a mixture of perlite and hydroton. You can use, if you have a big enough rock wool cube, you can just go straight rock wool if you did choose. But I find hydroton just on its own, it works great for drainage. It has good airflow, so I don't really feel a need to add anything else to it.
And then at what point of the plant's life do you put it in the RDWC system? Like you mentioned that you start in rock wool. How long are you letting that plant grow in the rock wool until you're actually putting it into your system?
So you can really put it in at any stage, but normally if I have a set number of plants and I know I'm going to be using all of them, I'll put them in the RDWC as soon as possible, as soon as they have a taproot coming out of the rock wool, just so that they can get acclimated to the system. The roots can start growing through the net pot that they're going to actually be in. I mean, the earlier the better, really.
Okay, and then since the roots aren't actually reaching the water at that point, are you doing some sort of top feeding until the plant establishes roots in the bucket?
Yeah, so I'll definitely top feed for the first couple of weeks, at least until the first roots hit the water. I like to even continue top feeding for a few weeks after that to ensure we have a strong base of roots coming out of the net pot. That's really important.
And then water level within the actual buckets, what do you aim for?
So in the early stages, I'll always recommend people to keep their water level a little bit below the net pot. That way you have a nice safe space of moist air. It's really hard for any rot to form there. But once you have a good root zone forming, you really want to bring that water level all the way up to the bottom of that net pot, just so that there's no water there's no roots that are exposed to air and not intaking nutrients.
What would happen in that case? Like if somebody were to have that water level really low?
It's just less of the root mass that can absorb and help the plant out. Since it's just sitting out in the air, it's not really doing much.
Now, what if you have too much water in there that you bring it, the water's really all the way into the net pots?
So you definitely want to leave a little bit of room so that the plant can breathe. You don't want it to be oversaturated where the rock wool is. You want the rock wool to actually be pretty dry, and then you don't want there to be any moisture until that water level under the net pot.
Getting into nutrients next, what do you use for nutrients? And do you target a specific EC or ppm for the different stages of growth?
Yeah, so I use synthetic nutrients. I was running Floraflex for the past couple of years, but recently I've switched to drip hydro, and that's something new that I'm kind of trying out. But my ppm will differ from grow to grow, just depending on strain and how the plants are intaking. That's one of the nice things about RDWC is you can see that pretty easily. But generally speaking, for veg, I'll start around a zero point 0.3. I'll work my way up to a 0.9, 1.0, and then once we get into flower, I'll give them an initial boost to around a 1.2. I'll work my way up to a 1.5, and then I begin tapering back down after week 5 to 6, eventually to 0 ppm flush.
Got it. And then do you monitor the pH as well? If so, what do you aim for?
Yeah, so definitely I do monitor my pH. I think it's really crucial for anyone to do the same. Generally, I aim for a 5.8. I don't get super scientific about it and change it depending on the growth stage. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I run a little bit lighter approach. I'll pH my mixes to 5.8, and then I'll let it ride until it's a mid 6 before I do adjust anything. Ideally, I'm aiming for the pH to stay pretty steady throughout the week so I don't have to adjust it at all.
And then another thing to mention in regards to water is the water temperature. Super important when growing hydroponically. What water temperature do you aim for?
So my water temperature usually sits around 73 to 77, which really isn't necessarily in the ideal range at all. But I do choose to not run a chiller in my garden, so the water temps kind of mimic the room temperatures a lot.
What would be the ideal water temperature?
So ideally, you want the water temperature to be around 68 degrees because higher temps do lead to less dissolved oxygen in the water, and that can lead to root rot, pathogens forming in your root zone. But as long as you are running a beneficial bacteria and the temperatures don't rise over 80, you're in a pretty good spot.
Oh, it's good to know. Yeah, it's one of the concerns for me doing hydroponics. I'm about to start for the first time, and I've got a DWC bucket, but it's always been the water temperature has been a concern because I live in the desert, and it's naturally, my water temp could easily reach 80, if not in the high 70s, right? So the high 70s, you're saying is achievable as long as you're treating the water you mentioned?
Yes, high 70s is definitely achievable. My water is at 77 degrees. A lot more than I would like it to be, but with the addition of the beneficial bacteria, it really does a great job of keeping everything healthy. So the temperature, as long as you're adding it every week, the temperature, it's not the end of the world.
What is it that you're adding in for bennies?
Oh, the beneficial bacteria. So I was running HydroGuard. I'm recently switched to Impello Bio. They have something called Continuum. So that's something that we're trying out recently.
Now, each week, the nutrient requirements are going to change. Also, it's a good general practice to clean out the reservoir. How often are you changing out the reservoir? And do you have any cleaning tips?
So I do weekly water changes throughout the entire grow cycle for the most part. Sometimes early on when the plants are really young, I'll let them run in the same res for 2 weeks, but that's pretty much max. The solution will start to degrade, so it's best to just keep everything fresh weekly. Generally, I'm only cleaning the system between runs. I'll use a descaler to get rid of any of the salt buildup, anything that may be stuck in the piping, but that can't be done while we are growing because that will kill the beneficial bacteria that we're trying to keep alive.
Understood. Going back to the chiller for a minute, I know you don't run one, but there's some folks in the audience that are wondering what is a chiller? Can you explain what a chiller is and kind of everything else about it, like how much a chiller costs, how much it will actually lower the temperature of the water, and so on and so forth?
So a water chill is basically an AC for the water. It's a piece of equipment you can run your water through to get it down to your desired temperature. So if you wanted it at 68 degrees, you could set that on the chiller and it would achieve that. I don't really have a reason as to why I don't run a chiller anymore. At first, it was just a cost thing because they are $300 to $400. They can be even more expensive. And I just wanted to keep my electricity down as much as possible. So that's pretty much why I don't run one. And now that I've been successful for so long without one, I feel like I don't even need it.
Got it. Yeah, I know a lot of people have been complaining about the power consumption, it being just so expensive to run those things.
Right.
And that was another thing that kind of deterred me from doing hydroponics because I thought that I would need a water chiller. And that additional expense right now, I don't really want to spend the money on a water chiller, but learning what I learned today about how I can potentially run a higher water temp in the high 70s, for example, and just have the beneficial bacteria in there, that's probably a route that I'm going to try out for sure.
I think that a lot of that belief actually comes from like with the HPS lighting that it just threw off so much heat that it was nearly impossible to keep the water temperature in check, like no matter what you did. But now that everyone's using LEDs, they're not putting off as much heat, and with the beneficial bacteria, it's definitely possible.
That makes sense. So you talked about the different ppm or EC that you aim for the different stages of growth. And you also hinted towards the beginning of the episode that you flush your plants towards the end of the cycle. How do you go about doing that end of cycle flush?
So I do flush all my runs for a minimum of 3 days, sometimes a week or more. In RDWC, you really only need about 3 days of flush, but I will try to time my harvest on the trichome stages more than anything else. So if the flush is a little bit too early and the trichomes aren't quite where I want them to be, I'll extend the flush for a few more days. But I don't like going over 7 days because you can tell the plants really start to suffer after that. And really the only important part of my flush is that I'm using the 0 ppm RO water, and we're making sure to not only refill and empty the system once, but multiple times to make sure we're getting every last bit of anything out.
Got it. So there are lots of problems that can occur in recirculating deep water culture or any really hydroponic system. What are some of those common problems that growers may encounter when either setting up or growing in an RDWC system?
So when it comes to setting up a system, one of the biggest concerns is making sure you have a circulation pump for the right size. Something that's too big will actually result in you just overflowing naturally. So it's always good to test that out. Make sure your water level is even throughout on all the buckets. Also, the other most important thing is your air pump. So you want to make sure you have a big enough air pump that's putting out enough air so that your root zones don't suffocate. And once you have those two things down, pretty much you're good to go.
Awesome. There's a couple problems that I'm aware of that I figured I'd fire off and see if you had any solutions to it. One of them would be the struggle to have different cultivars in the same system. You've got one nutrient mix that's being fed to all different plants, and generally speaking, different cultivars are going to uptake nutrients differently. Do you come across problems where it's like some plants are deficient while some plants are toxic or anything like that?
Yeah, actually, that's pretty common. I really try to run the same strain throughout the entire system if I can. I know that gets a little bit boring sometimes, but I have had instances where I have one strain that's just completely toxic. It's getting way too much, but if I have 5 other ones that are doing well, then I'm going to worry about those more than just the one that is off. So I try to favor the masses, I guess, to make up for that. But really, there's not much you can do. That's one of the downsides of sharing, the same solution for all plants. You're going to have to run the same strain.
Got it. And you mentioned same strain. Are you going to the point where it's like same strain as in same cut, or same strain as in like it can be from seed, just the same strain?
Yeah, no, from seed, just the same strain. Definitely, it doesn't have to be the cut. I mean, even the phenos are going to differ a little bit, but it's not like big enough to where you're going to like notice a huge one's going to be deficient where the other one isn't. You really won't have that problem.
Okay. Another problem that is pretty common, and we already kind of touched upon it, which is maintaining the water temp, keeping that water temp lower. Now, chiller was one solution, right? But there are some hacks out there, right, that you could do. Like I know some people do the frozen water bottles in order to kind of lower the temp in the reservoir in the system. Is there any other hacks like that to lower the water temp that you know of?
I guess the only thing that you can do that's going to really control it is keeping your room temperatures down. So if you control your room to 75 degrees, the water is going to be 73 to 77. And if you go down even lower, say 70 degrees, you're going to be pretty close to that ideal range. Um, the one thing I would say about adding the ice things to the buckets is just be careful that if that is a plant, if that's a plant bucket and the ice is actually touching the roots, that can be a little bit dangerous. So you can do that in like your control res, but I wouldn't add ice to like anything that has a root zone in it.
That makes sense. Another problem that actually may not be a big problem is algae. So algae can kind of show up, particularly on, you might have seen it on the clay pebbles. I know rock wool, it can show up. People who do only rock wool grows have algae on them oftentimes. Actually, on a side note, I need to get somebody on the podcast who grows in rock wool. If anybody has any suggestions, put it down in the comment section below here. But algae, do you worry about that at all? If so, like, what do you do about it?
Actually, I don't. So in the system, you're not going to really have much algae because you have the beneficial bacteria in there. It's not going to really be growing on the inside of the bucket. The one place you may get it is on top of that rock wool, and that would really only happen is if you're top feeding and then it's staying damp on there for a little bit too long. But after those first couple of weeks, you really aren't top feeding anyway, so there's not much water getting up on top or even on that hydron at all. So you're really not going to have much of an algae problem, or at least you shouldn't.
Another common problem that people face, particularly when they're building their own systems, is leaks, right? So, do you have any kind of best practices for how to handle leaks? I mean, do you recommend that folks put together the system and then kind of check for leaks initially, or do they check for leaks frequently, or how do you go about leaks?
So that's why I actually mentioned that thing about the current culture bulkheads, because that's going to give you the best chance of not running into a leak. So it's worth spending a little bit extra on those. But yeah, I would definitely say once you have the system built, fill it up with water. Make sure that the pumps are running evenly. Make sure you're not going to overflow. And most importantly, make sure that you are not leaking, because if you start growing and you run a leak, it's going to be really, really hard to like plug it or fill it from the outside while there's water in the system. So you can do stuff like that, but you're going to have to empty everything out, try to fix it, and then you're kind of just crossing your fingers. So it's best to make sure that the system is solid, everything is perfect before you put plants in it. I wouldn't rush that part at all, because there is a lot of water that is potentially can spill. So
Good advice. Now, talking about equipment, was wondering what pH meter do you use?
what pH meter? So I use actually just got a new setup. It's called it's from Pulse, and it's a pH and a ppm monitor that is always in my res, and it connects to my phone. So that has actually made things really, really nice. I can see like not only what the pH and ppm is currently, but what it's done like over however long. So it's really nice to see things if they're steady, see if things are dropping. That gives you a ton of information.
That's awesome. Does it also show water temperature on there as well?
Yes, it does. It shows you water temperature, and then I think eventually they're even going to be adding something that's measuring the aeration in the water. So that's going to be great as well.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Yeah, so some really good advancements with Pulse. I know they also have like moisture meters that you can put in your soil, and yeah, that's definitely a company that is innovative.
Yeah, I've actually been working with them for a few years, and they've been great all the way through. So I really enjoy their products.
So there are a lot of folks that are beginners and they're just starting out growing with hydroponics, whether it be a DWC system, an RDWC system. Narrowing it down to RDWC, that's your bread and butter. What advice do you have for beginners who are really just getting started using this system?
When you start out, you really have two options. I know I already told you guys to run the beneficial bacteria, but your other option is going to be running a sterile res, which I would definitely recommend not doing. It's going to be a much tougher time to keep things sterile, whereas if you add the beneficial bacteria, it's kind of just a set and forget as long as you keep adding it weekly. So that's something to definitely maybe steer away from. If you wanted to, I would say try it out later on, but it's pretty difficult to keep a sterile system. And I know we are narrowing it down to RDWC, but I tend to recommend for people to do start out with a single bucket. That way you can really focus on one plant. You can get a good understanding of DWC, how everything works, and then expanding on that plant count is really nothing more than what you've already done.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah, some good tips there. So we have flown through this episode. It's been super quick. I don't have any more questions for you. And maybe it's because I am kind of just getting started with hydroponics myself. I've been growing soil, cocoa for the entire time I've been growing since 2010, 14 years now, which is hard to imagine. And yeah, I'm just going to be getting into hydroponics here this year. So I'm really excited for that. Is there anything else we need to know about RDWC that we didn't cover in this talk?
No, I think we did a pretty good job of getting through just about everything you need to know to actually successfully grow in RDWC.
Sweet. Well, short, straight to the point. I love it. Let's wrap things up here. Can you tell listeners how they can find you and what you have upcoming in the future?
Sure. So you can find me on YouTube at Inside Hydro Grow, Instagram Inside Hydro with 2 O's. I know the usernames are slightly different because we've lost so many accounts, but I do have a website, insidehydro.com. You can pretty much link to anything off of there. And we are mid-run here with this V-Grow box, so we have a harvest coming up. And then if you are looking to get into RDWC, it's the perfect time because we're doing some room system upgrades and we're starting a brand new run. So I have that coming up within the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. We'll definitely have a link to Corey's YouTube channel down in the YouTube description section below so you can easily get to his channel. Check out his vids. He's got some really good content. It's very entertaining, informative, straight to the point, just like this episode was. So I enjoy it, and I think a lot of you guys will as well. So good stuff, man. Thanks so much for coming on. This has been awesome, very insightful for me, and I'm sure it's been insightful for some of my audience as well. So appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
Peace out, everyone. Catch you in the next episode.